Major breaking news. Turkey launches its military offensive against the Kurds in northern Syria. Turkish jets take off just 2 days after US forces were withdrawn from the area. Kurdish positions are now being hit by artillery fire following a build-up of Turkish military hardware on the border. In the last half an hour, Kurdish fighters say they've now stopped their anti-ISIS operations because they say it's impossible to carry on while being threatened by an army on the ground. Also on Global, 2 people have been killed in a shooting near a synagogue in eastern Germany. 1 person has been arrested, another is still on the run as a huge police operation continues. And the White House refuses to cooperate with the impeachment inquiry against Donald Trump. We'll hear from the former Republican Senator Jeff Flake, a critic of the president. Welcome back to the programme, and let's return straight away to that major breaking news of the day. Turkey's president has said the military operation against Kurdish fighters in northeastern Syria has begun. President Erdogan insisted the aim was to destroy what he called a terror corridor on Turkey's southern border. There are multiple reports of explosions inside Syria. We've seen the pictures of that. We've seen people trying to actually get away from that border region. Well, the withdrawal of the US troops from the region at the start of the week paved the way for these operations. And that decision by Donald Trump has been savaged domestically and internationally. Let me show you some of the latest pictures. These Turkish aircraft taking off as part of the operations. In the last couple of hours, the Kurdish-led SDF asked the US to impose a no-fly zone to stop Turkish attacks. Well, these pictures show the aftermath of blasts which hit a town near the Syrian border, a town which is home to Kurdish military bases and also to ammunition stores. We'll get the latest from Washington. We'll get the latest also from the BBC's Middle East editor in a moment or two. But first, Orla Guerin, our correspondent, is there on Turkey's border with Syria. She gave us this update.
So we have been seeing and hearing the opening salvos of this Turkish offensive on northeastern Syria. If you're hearing noise in the background now, it's police vehicles that are going around announcing to civilians to leave the area. We have heard outgoing artillery fire and mortar rounds. There has been incoming mortar fire also from just across the border in northeastern Syria, but it didn't reach as far as Turkish territory. Now, President Erdogan has said this is the beginning of Operation Peace Spring, as he calls it, but I think there's no doubt that for the Syrian civilians who are just across the border within sight of us here, this is going to feel like another round of battle in an agonizingly long war. The Turks' stated objectives here are twofold. First of all, they say they want to create what they call a safe zone, or essentially a buffer, a security buffer along their border. And they say they want to allow for the return of about 2 million Syrian refugees. Now, Turkey has been hosting 3.6 million Syrians. It's a considerable burden on the economy. It's a political issue for President Erdogan, and he is anxious to see those refugees go back. But the Syrian Kurdish forces say that actually what's at stake here is demographic engineering, that the Turks wish to send Syrian Arab refugees across the border into this part of northeastern Syria, which they regard very much as Kurdish territory. So they claim this is really an attempt to dilute their influence and their control. And of course, they also have been emphasizing almost frantically in the last few days that the gains that have been made and were so hard fought and hard won in their long battle against Islamic State are now being put at risk. I mean, the Syrian Democratic Forces have lost an estimated 11,000 fighters in battling IS. They succeeded, with American help, to push IS out of a large swathe of territory, but they say that those gains are at risk. They point out that, for example, they may have to withdraw some of their forces from the prisons where they are guarding about 10,000 IS fighters. They say they may have to withdraw men from territory that has been recently liberated from IS. And they point out that just last night there was an attack in Raqqa. Now, you'll remember that was the former capital of the IS caliphate. And last night, 3 IS suicide bombers struck Kurdish positions in the city. So the Kurds are basically saying to the international community, the war that we fought on your behalf is now being put at risk. All of those gains are now at risk because of what Turkey is trying to do.
Well, that's Ola Guerin on the ground. Let me give you some of the latest lines, because NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has been talking and has said that Turkey's actions in northern Syria must be proportionate and measured, not that Turkey has assured him they will be proportionate and measured. So an interesting clause there that Jens Stoltenberg has added, urging Turkey to be proportionate and measured in their response, but making the point that he's had no such assurance from Ankara. He has gone on also to say that and warns that the fight against Islamic State should not be put at risk. Now, interesting he should say that, because in the last 20 minutes or so, we know that the SDF, one of the Kurdish groups, has said that they are now stopping their fight against Islamic State fighters because it is impossible, they say, to carry out any operation while you're being threatened by a large army right on your northern border. So very interesting what NATO Secretary-General has said, and very interesting to that line that's come from the Kurdish fighters on the ground. Well, just a little earlier, I spoke to our Middle East editor, Jeremy Byrne, who explained that Turkey had warned they would take action before we saw what we saw.
They've said that this is something that they had to do. And all this came from a few days ago, you'll remember, when Donald Trump put out a tweet essentially saying the US no longer had any objection to all of this, that some of their troops would be pulled out. And it was, essentially a green light for the Turks and for President Erdogan to send in his troops.
And he has, and it is a major offensive. We've seen the hardware, the pictures of the aircraft, we've seen the military hardware on the ground, we saw the build-up for a couple of days. What we don't know at this stage, Jeremy, do we, is whether the Kurdish fighters will stay and fight.
No, we don't know that, but the thing to remember about them is that while they fought very effectively on the ground against the jihadists of Islamic State, it's a different thing now. They'd be coming up, if they wanted to fight the Turks, they'd be fighting a big NATO army, the second biggest force in NATO. So I don't think that any military guy on their side is going to suggest that they try and take them on. They may in some places, who knows. There may be behind the scenes talks going on via a third party about, you might go there, but we might be here, that sort of thing. Maybe the Turks want to calm things down while they keep up this high level of rhetoric. The fact is, though, what underlies this from the Turkish point of view is that they really, really believe that these Kurds on that side of the border, who've been allied with the United States, are terrorists, that they are very connected with the Kurdish separatists in the PKK in Turkey, who've been active for many, many years, and that is why they want to go after them.
And that's the extraordinary nature of the turnaround from US policy. As you exactly say, they've been fighting alongside the Americans for years now against Islamic State, and now the Turks going after them as terrorists. Do we know at this stage just how far President Erdogan wants to go into Syria?
No, we don't. There have been various bits of speculation about it. The Turks are already in northwestern Syria, so this is northeastern Syria, and they seem to want to establish what in South Lebanon the Israelis used to call the security zone, a strip of land that they feel would deal with, as he called it, Erdogan called it, this so-called corridor of terror. But it's not clear exactly what they want, what their objectives are in terms of territory, but I think they do want to change the game in that part of Syria, and that for Erdogan is very important.
The worrying thing, and we saw this, we talked right at the start of the week after this decision from Donald Trump, the worrying thing for all of those international observers, the people who've criticised the president's move, is unforeseen consequences of what we're now seeing being played out here on the ground.
When militaries go to war, there are always unforeseen consequences. That is absolutely going to happen. So it could be that the Turks are going to be quite cautious I think that they might be wanting to play a clever political game at the same time in terms of the reactions of the US and their other NATO allies. You know, we'll see how far they push. It's interesting, they've started these big fires near the border that the cameras of the media can see very, very easily. What might they be doing further in? Well, we don't really know.
Well, you talk about the border, and these are the live pictures coming in from just one of the positions. And here at the BBC, we have just a number of different feeds from the different agencies, as well as our teams on the ground. So we'll bring you constantly the updated pictures and developments as they happen. In terms of developments, just in the last few minutes as I was heading down to the studio, the French, the British looking to try to get the UN Security Council to meet in emergency session. Diplomatically, there'll be moves to try to pull this back.
Yep, there will be. In this kind of event, there is always, very, very often anyway, a special session of the UN Security Council. That is exactly what it's for, to try to regulate these kinds of things, to try and calm it down, to push for some kind of a ceasefire. But I think at the moment, well, it's still very, very early days, and it's not clear exactly where the Turks are going to go. Will they take that whole strip along the frontier, or will it be more limited than that? I think that, you know, this is going to be developing.
One of the areas of concern is, of course, IS fighters captured by the Kurdish forces over the last couple of years. Thousands. I think there are 4,000 foreign nationals, as well as all of the others. The concern is quite what happens to them as a result of all of this.
Yeah, because most of them are in prisons guarded by the Kurds. There are others who are guarded by the Americans, but essentially the Kurds are in charge of those prisons, and they are further back from the area where they've pushed in at the moment. But yes, this is one of the major worries about all of this, that IS fighters might break out, they might have a resurgence. There's an IS resurgence already going on in Syria and Iraq in terms of guerrilla activity, in terms of bombings. And this is the kind of thing that might give it the kind of push that they dream of.
Well, that was Jeremy Bowen. Let me show you more of the pictures, because pictures from one of the border towns, Ras Ain, where the Kurdish fighters have said that Turkish airstrikes have killed 2 civilians. This is just some of the aftermath in that town, with the SDF saying, "We call on all of the countries of the international coalition to bear their responsibility and prevent a possible imminent humanitarian crisis." That one of the latest statements from the Syrian Democratic Forces. They have also, in the last little while, and it is worth repeating it, said that they have stopped their operations against ISIS fighters so they could concentrate on what they are now facing with the Turkish army. So let's head to Washington. Let's talk again to Gary O'Donoghue, our correspondent. Gary, let's start with that straight away, because there were so many people in the condemnation of President Trump's abrupt change of policy, warning about the potential consequences with IS and a resurgence. That doesn't look good, what we have just heard from Kurdish fighters.
No, that's absolutely right. One of Donald Trump's staunchest allies, Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator, said in a tweet this morning, this move ensures the re-emergence of ISIS. And of course, we have seen, as Jeremy was mentioning just a moment ago, I mean, in Raqqa yesterday, several suicide bombings by ISIS against the SDF, who are in control there. So there is activity already happening, with the SDF now saying they're going to stop those counter-ISIS operations. That will give ISIS some room to breathe, obviously. And of course, the question of the prison camps and whether or not they continue to be guarded by the SDF will also be an issue. If anyone, some of these, I mean, there's 10,000 fighters potentially in those camps could get out. So there are all sorts of permutations. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, we're looking at one report that says we could get this Security Council meeting potentially tomorrow, not confirmed as yet. And the extraordinary thing, I think, Matthew, is that here in Washington, there's been an absolute silence from the White House, from the State Department, from the National Security Council, from the Pentagon. Nothing at all.
I suppose perhaps that might underline that this policy really was moved changed by one man without all of those other areas that you just alluded to. So it is for the president to have a further say on this. We know there was that telephone conversation with Turkey's president. Do we think that the US president has any sort of knowledge of just how far Turkey wants to go inside of Syria?
I'm not sure we do know that. I mean, we know, of course, that the president publicly threatened Turkey if it took any action. It was slightly vague what action he would consider acceptable and what action he would consider unacceptable. But he did threaten to obliterate their economy. Well, we'll see if this action constitutes that, but we just don't know. What we do know, and what we get an indication here from some of our colleagues at CBS, is that Turkish jets are getting pretty much the freedom of the skies. That seems to be the case, in that American aircraft are not, we understand, going to be engaging Turkish aircraft at all. I mean, that would be two NATO allies fighting, which is pretty unlikely. But then the Americans will only go to the skies if it's to protect their own forces, these 1,000 or so troops that are in the area. So in the sense that the SDF were calling earlier on for a sort of no-fly zone to be policed, patrolled by the coalition forces, including the Americans, that clearly isn't happening at the moment.
All right, Gary O'Donoghue, thanks once again, live for us there in Washington with the latest lines on that story. We'll talk again a little later in the programme. Gary, for now, thanks a lot. Well, we'll return to that Syria story in the next couple of minutes. We won't turn away from it for too long, but there is another major breaking story from Germany through the course of today, where police in the city of Halle say 2 people have been killed in a shooting. 1 person has been arrested. The shooting took place outside of a synagogue. There are also reports of a second shooting in Landsberg, which is around 15 kilometres from Halle. Well, the BBC's Frank Gardner, our security correspondent, took us through what we know so far.
The first report spoke of an attack on a synagogue, and it was very unclear exactly what had happened. But because today is Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, that, of course, raised suspicions that this could be some kind of terrorist attack. Then further details came out that a man had attacked a Turkish restaurant, a kebab shop, and we heard some details of it there. And then there were reports that a hand grenade had been thrown into a Jewish cemetery. Now, it does appear that, tragic as although this is, with 2 people killed, 2 more injured and being treated in hospital, it could have been far, far worse. And what this appears to me to look like is very similar to the Christchurch attack on the Christchurch mosques and I'm not saying necessarily who did it, but in the sense of an attack on a religious place of worship. So the synagogue, an official from the synagogue has confirmed that they were a target. So it does appear to be politically or religiously motivated. Now, very importantly, 2 people fled the scene in a car, and one of them has been apprehended, which is very important. So he or she is in custody with the police.
Well, that brings me on to the picture I'm going to put on the screen now, because we have a still picture of one of the attackers. There you see him shooting from behind the car. We know there's been 1 arrest, but there are 1, if not more, people still on the loose, aren't there?
Yes. So I've seen, this is a still from a videotape clip that was posted on Twitter this afternoon. And you can see he's wearing a helmet. He's in kind of khaki-coloured military-style clothing, firing single shots with a huge amount of smoke, as you can see there. I mean, it appears to be a pistol, but there's a lot of smoke coming out. Not clear what he's firing at. Now, the German authorities closed down the local railway station in case the attacker or attackers fled there and tried to escape by train. So there is still, this is ongoing. There's a manhunt underway.
Final quick thought, in terms of links to terrorism, how significant is it that federal prosecutors have now taken over the investigation?
That shows that this has been elevated to a national security crisis for Germany. The Interior Minister said only a month ago that the threat from far-right extremism is just as big as that from jihadist terrorism. So he's put it basically on the same parallel.
Frank Gardner. Now, as promised, let's return very much to our main story, that Turkish incursion into northeastern Syria. Pressure now building on the international community to act. Let me just tell you, on the diplomacy front, the Dutch foreign minister has summoned the Turkish ambassador over this offensive, so addressing down there. So we see a variety of diplomatic moves. The UN, of course, has been urged to intervene. We know they are going to have that emergency session tomorrow. I've also been talking to the UK's former Minister of State for the Middle East, Alistair Burt, who says the Security Council needs to meet urgently now to address these matters.
I think the first thing is to try and find out exactly how extensive this will be. I think the world has always recognised that a state has the right to defend itself from terror. And President Erdogan has always said that some of those who were in the Syrian side of the border as Kurdish forces were those who were allied to those committing terror in Turkey. And people understand that. But the difficulty has been that he has not distinguished between different groups in the same way the rest of the world has distinguished. And some of those that fear attacked are those Kurdish forces that fought against ISIS, freed Kobani and Manbij, and took part in actions which saved all the rest of us. Yeah. And there's severe concern about how far this will go. So I think what has to be done is to try and find out, firstly, the Security Council has got to meet quickly. It's got to ascertain from Turkey what it intends to do, because if it's limited, that's one thing. But if it's extensive as feared, then the world is going to face a much bigger problem. Is
this the new world order, though, that President Trump can make a decision like this and about turn without even consulting his allies like the UK or people closer who have been there on the ground on this as well? And in terms of the implications for IS fighters who've already been captured, and Washington now saying that's the responsibility now of Turkey, how concerned are you about both those areas?
Well, being blunt, if you're saying, is this the new world order in terms of decisions being taken, it looks as though it is. And this is very frightening. The world built up a multilateral system of international world order to try and make sure that unilateral actions did not take place. We've seen that break down. The Security Council has not been able to prevent conflict in recent years. And this is what has produced the situation in Syria. And what it means is that strong individuals are prepared to act on their own unilaterally. This is highly dangerous, and we need to return to a situation in which decisions are taken in concert, recognizing the pressures that are on particular states, including that from terrorism, but trying to ensure that action is not taken unilaterally, which can produce the situation which we're seeing today. So yes, I think I am extremely concerned about where this is going. The world order has to re-establish itself soon, because at the moment, as we see in Syria, the only people who are making decisions are those with guns and those with boots on the ground. Everyone else, for all the talk, are essentially irrelevant.
Well, that was Alistair Burt, former British Minister of State. Let me give you the latest, actually, that is coming from the French, because their Secretary of State for European Affairs has just been speaking, who said France, Germany and Britain are finalising a joint statement that will be extremely clear about the fact that we condemn very strongly and firmly what has been reported. We are taking it to the UN Security Council and seeking the biggest possible coalition to bring the subject to discussion as quickly as possible. So strong words there from the French, and they are saying they're formulating that draft statement that goes to the Security Council for that session tomorrow. Well, let's rewind slightly, because this operation has been going now a number of hours. Let's just go back to what President Erdogan said right at the start, because as he announced that Turkey and its Syrian rebel allies had launched their military operations into northeastern Syria, he said the offensive aims to eliminate the terror corridor along the southern Turkish border. He said the offensive, dubbed Operation Peace Spring, would aim to eliminate threats from the Syrian Kurdish YPG militia and the Islamic State militants. He said it would enable the return of Syrian refugees in Turkey after the formation of what he calls a safe zone in the area. Well, my colleague Ece Gökseraf is back with me from Turkish service, and you've been talking to people right through since this offensive started. What are they saying to you, those Turkish officials?
So the operation started on a specific area between Talabet and Ras Lain, but the Turkish officials, Turkish security officials, say that they are aiming to go further all the border, which is controlled by the YPG, which is almost 500 kilometers. And also they are saying that they are aiming to create this safe zone in a 30 kilometers of that, which will host around 2 million Syrian refugees. But as far as we know, the US soldiers withdrew only from a specific area. So we will see what's going to be on the ground, how far they can go, Turkish soldiers can go during the operation.
And in terms of the numbers of Kurdish fighters, I did ask you a while ago, but for anyone joining us, I mean, we know the size of the Turkish operation. How many Kurdish fighters are there?
As far as we know, the Syrian Democratic Forces has more than 50,000 soldiers, but the YPG forces in it, as far as we know, is 20,000. The number is 20,000, which is based on the northern areas of the controlled area by the YPG. But actually, they control more than 1/4 of Syria, so we cannot be sure about the numbers, but that's what we know approximately.
All right, thanks for the latest. We're going to take a short break. In a moment, we're back with the very latest on this very rapidly moving story. We'll bring you the latest pictures, we'll bring you the latest statements coming from various capitals. As I say, plenty more on this, our main story. Don't go away. No, it would be better to have the other one. Major breaking news. Turkey launches its military offensive against the Kurds in northern Syria. It'd be better to change it back, Caroline. Turkish jets take off just 2 days after US forces were withdrawn from the area. Kurdish positions are now being hit by artillery fire following a build-up of Turkish military hardware on the border. And the last hour, Kurdish fighters say they've stopped their anti-ISIS operations because they say it's impossible to carry on while being threatened by the Turkish army on the ground. Also on Global, 2 people have been killed in a shooting near a synagogue in eastern Germany. 1 person has been arrested, another is still on the run as the huge operation continues. Major breaking news. Turkey launches its military offensive against the Kurds in northern Syria. Turkish jets take off just 2 days after US forces were withdrawn from the area. Kurdish positions are now being hit by artillery fire following a build-up of Turkish military hardware on the border. And in the last hour, Kurdish fighters say they've stopped their anti-ISIS operations because they say it's impossible to carry on while being threatened by the Turkish army on the ground. Also on Global, 2 people have been killed in a shooting near a synagogue in eastern Germany. 1 person has been arrested, another is still on the run as a huge police operation continues. Well, let's return straight away to our breaking news. Turkey's president has said the military operation against Kurdish fighters in northeast Syria has begun. President Erdogan insisted the aim was to destroy what he called a terror corridor on Turkey's southern border. The withdrawal of US troops from the region at the start of the week paved the way for these operations. That decision by Donald Trump savaged both domestically and internationally. Well, our correspondent Orla Guerin is on the Turkish side of the border with Syria, and earlier she gave us this update.
So we have been seeing and hearing the opening salvos of this Turkish offensive on northeastern Syria. If you're hearing noise in the background now, it's police vehicles that are going around announcing to civilians to leave the area. We have heard outgoing artillery fire and mortar rounds. There has been incoming mortar fire also from just across the border in northeastern Syria, but it didn't reach as far as Turkish territory. Now, President Erdogan has said this is the beginning of Operation Peace Spring, as he calls it, but I think there's no doubt that for the Syrian civilians who are just across the border within sight of us here, this is going to feel like another round of battle in an agonizingly long war. The Turks' stated objectives here are twofold. First of all, they say they want to create what they call a safe zone, or essentially a buffer, a security buffer along their border. And they say they want to allow for the return of about 2 million Syrian refugees. Now, Turkey has been hosting 3.6 million Syrians. It's a considerable burden on the economy. It's a political issue for President Erdogan, and he is anxious to see those refugees go back. But the Syrian Kurdish forces say that actually what's at stake here is demographic engineering, that the Turks wish to send Syrian Arab refugees across the border into this part of northeastern Syria, which they regard very much as Kurdish territory. So they claim this is really an attempt to dilute their influence and their control. And of course, they also have been emphasizing almost frantically in the last few days that the gains that have been made and were so hard fought and hard won in their long battle against Islamic State are now being put at risk. I mean, the Syrian Democratic Forces have lost an estimated 11,000 fighters in battling IS. They succeeded, with American help, to push IS out of a large swathe of territory. But they say that those gains are at risk. They point out that, for example, they may have to withdraw some of their forces from the prisons where they are guarding about 10,000 IS fighters. They say they may have to withdraw men from territory that has been recently liberated from IS. And they point out that just last night there was an attack in Raqqa. Now, you'll remember that was the former capital of the IS Caliphate. And last night, 3 IS suicide bombers struck Kurdish positions in the city. So the Kurds are basically saying to the international community that the war that we fought on your behalf is now being put at risk. All of those gains are now at risk because of what Turkey is trying to do.
President Erdogan's spokesman, speaking to me just in the last couple of hours, Orla, said of the Kurdish fighters, they better pull out. They better pull out. And yet the point has been made by politicians in Washington, for example, that the Kurds have been instrumental in defeating the self-styled Islamic State and, as you say, in holding thousands of prisoners.
Well, first of all, I think it's very unlikely that the Kurds would want to pull out. They have said that they will stand and fight, that they will resist. They have called for civilians to mobilise over a 3-day period and to get to the border and operate as a human shield, and indeed to help them by taking up arms. So I don't think the Kurds will be of a mood that they should surrender to the Turks. But also the issue is this: if they were to pull out, there would be a very dangerous security vacuum. President Trump himself emphasised earlier on during the week that as far as he's concerned, the many IS prisoners are Turkey's problem, that it's up to Turkey to make sure that they remain secure, that they do not have a chance to regroup, that jailbreaks cannot take place in a moment of chaos during a conflict. And certainly the position of the Kurds is that if they have to focus now on defending themselves and their territory, that will have to be their first priority, not the security of the IS prisoners.
We're witnessing the Turkish military incursion, but what's happening as far as other Syrian forces are concerned? I mean, are they involved or do we just not know?
Well, so far it's very unclear what's happening across the border, and the only indication we've had of a military response from that side is some incoming mortar fire, which actually fell short of the border position where we are. So those mortars did not land on Turkish territory. But I think now that the offensive has begun, certainly the Syrian Kurds will be moving into high gear to try and defend their territory. Excuse me. They will be moving into high gear to try and defend their territory. And I think the other immediate consequence will probably be yet another round of displacement for the many Syrian civilians on the other side. Now, the European Union was warning this week before the operation even began that there could be massive displacement. We had warnings also from the UN, from their humanitarian officials, that they were preparing for the worst, essentially. So I think there will be huge concern now about what happens to civilians who will be trapped on the other side of this.
And just to pick up on what you're saying there, Orla, we do have reports coming in from Syrian Kurdish media about saying that on the ground the first wave of refugees has begun evacuating the bombed areas in Tal Abyad, also the predominantly Kurdish town of Ras Al Ain. We've been talking about these two towns in particular, and that concern that you've identified about more refugees being created is a concern at the UN as well. We've been hearing that in recent days.
Well, certainly Tal Abyad is just across the border from where I'm standing. And even as I'm speaking to you now, I can see smoke still rising from where a mortar landed. And it appeared, from what we can see with the naked eye, to be just outside a heavily populated area. I can see 3, 4, 5-story apartment blocks. So certainly this fell, as far as we can make out, at the edge of a at the edge of a residential district, and perhaps has caused damage to, or indeed injury to civilians who are there. But certainly it will cause a great deal of fear and anxiety, and it's not surprising to discover that civilians are already on the move. And you may be able to hear in the background here intermittently the noise of a loudhailer, which is actually local police here on the Turkish side, who are urging civilians to leave this area near the border.
Well, that was Orla Guerin there on the border, talking a little earlier to Philippa Thomas. She was talking there about the impact on people there in those border towns, the refugees. Let me just show you some of the latest pictures from one of those towns, the aftermath of some of the early bombardment, with people getting away as quickly as possible from some of the places that are being struck, both from the air and also from artillery on the ground. Those some of the pictures. It is worth talking about the refugees a little more because Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission President, has also been addressing what we're seeing on the screens. He says Turkey has security concerns at its border with Syria. However, I call on Turkey as well as on other actors to act with restraint and to stop operations. Already we are seeing them underway. The military action is not leading to a good result, and we bring this to the attention of our Turkish friends. He goes on to say, and this is where he turns to refugees, I have to say, if the Turkish plan involves the creation of so-called safe zones, he then says, don't expect the European Union to pay for any of it. He says a sustainable solution to the Syrian conflict can only be reached through a genuine political transition. So very interesting, those thoughts from Jean-Claude Juncker, urging restraint from the Turkish and making the point that if there are safe zones and that's where the refugees are taken, don't expect the European Union to pay for any of that, he says. Let me tell you another latest line coming in, because Egypt has condemned the action we are seeing in the strongest possible terms. They're calling for an emergency meeting of the Arab League to actually address what we're seeing on the ground. Now, we've been talking about refugees, the impact it is having on a human level. Well, the aid agencies say it will compound the number of refugees fleeing Syria. I've been speaking to Sonia Kush, the director of Syria operations for Save the Children, who's worked inside the refugee camps along the Syrian-Turkish border.
Well, obviously it's very concerning for us, mainly because we know about the potential impact on the humanitarian situation in northeast Syria. Northeast Syria already has more than 1.6 million people who are in need of assistance. So any sort of military incursion that causes additional displacement is going to have devastating consequences on civilians. And we really urge all military parties involved in this to make sure that the impact on civilians is taken into account and any negative effects avoided.
Just give me an idea, and people watching this around the world, give me an idea geographically how close this incursion will be to some of those camps that Save the Children are involved with.
Well, the attacks today happened near Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain and towards Ain Issa. So there is a camp in Ain Issa that hosts evacuees from Raqqa, including foreign women and children that were formerly associated with ISIS. So it actually is quite close to the camps. When we're talking about Al-Hol, that's a bit farther away. But in such a fluid situation, we just don't know how far this is going to go. And so we're very concerned about, as you mentioned, the camps. Those people are completely reliant on humanitarian assistance, and we can't afford any break in the services to them.
You mentioned IS fighters and IS or families of IS fighters. Is it clear to you what is likely to happen? What do you think should happen to those groups of people?
Our urgent request to the 40 different countries who have children living in those camps in very difficult conditions is to repatriate them. Children should not be growing up in a camp with poor services, with no freedom of movement. They're living under horrific conditions, having survived very traumatic lives under ISIS control, and we really need to get them home. So our call is to governments who can take them out now, because we know how to get them out, is to urgently repatriate them and give them a chance at a normal childhood.
Well, we know what various governments have said about that, and it's exactly the opposite at the moment. So those people are there in the camps, and we will see with this incursion, because the Americans have talked about it now being Turkey's responsibility to hold these captured fighters and their family. In terms of all of the other refugees, the Turkish plan is to move. You might have heard me asking Paul Adams to move most of the refugees in Turkey back into Syria. How practical is that?
I don't think it's very practical. When you look at the population that's in Turkey, it's been said that approximately 17% actually have come from northeast Syria. So you're talking about moving people back who are not from there. And the basic concept is that we're very much against forced returns in general. Returns need to be voluntary, they need to be safe, they need to be dignified. So any kind of forced return to Syria is really not acceptable to us.
Just a final quick thought. Will what we're seeing, this military operation, how much will that actually hamper physically what you are doing there on the ground?
It really depends on how far the operation goes and what Turkey does in terms of occupying land. If it's a short-term incursion, only a few kilometers into Syria, and then the troops pull out, it probably won't affect it very much. But we just don't know, and so we're very worried about any longer-term implications. We could start to see displacements. In fact, we are already seeing the displacements out of Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain, but that could increase. So you could see displacements all over northeast Syria, and it's going to be a challenge for organizations like Save the Children to provide assistance to those families in the middle of military operations.
Well, the latest from Save the Children on the humanitarian side, the refugees as a result of what we're seeing and the impact on them. Well, the decision by Donald Trump to withdraw US forces from northeast Syria paved the way right at the start of the week for this Turkish operation. There's been widespread criticism of the president's move from both sides of the political divide. A little earlier, I spoke to our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue in Washington.
One of Donald Trump's staunchest allies, Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator, said in a tweet this morning, this move ensures the re-emergence of ISIS. And of course, we have seen, as Jeremy was mentioning just a moment ago, I mean, in Raqqa yesterday, several suicide bombings by ISIS against the SDF, who are in control there. So there is activity already happening, with the SDF now saying they're going to stop those counter-ISIS operations. That will give ISIS some room to breathe, obviously. And of course, the question of the prison camps and whether or not they continue to be guarded by the SDF will also be an issue. If anyone, some of these, I mean, there's 10,000 fighters potentially in those camps could get out. So there are all sorts of permutations. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, we're looking at one report that says we could get this Security Council meeting potentially tomorrow, not confirmed as yet. And the extraordinary thing, I think, Matthew, is that here in Washington, there's been an absolute silence from the White House, from the State Department, from the National Security Council, from the Pentagon. Nothing at all.
I suppose perhaps that might underline that this policy really was changed by one man without all of those other areas that you just alluded to. So it is for the president to have a further say on this. We know there was that telephone conversation with Turkey's president. Do we think that the US president has any sort of knowledge of just how far Turkey wants to go inside of Syria?
I'm not sure we do know that. I mean, we know, of course, that the president publicly threatened Turkey if it took any action. It was slightly vague what action he would consider acceptable and what action he would consider unacceptable. But he did threaten to obliterate their economy. Well, we'll see if this action constitutes that, but we just don't know. What we do know, and what we get an indication here from some of our colleagues at CBS, is that Turkish jets are getting pretty much the freedom of the skies. That seems to be the case, in that American aircraft are not, we understand, going to be engaging Turkish aircraft at all. I mean, that would be two NATO allies fighting, which is pretty unlikely. But then the Americans will only go to the skies if it's to protect their own forces, these 1,000 or so troops that are in the area. So in the sense that the SDF were calling earlier on for a sort of no-fly zone to be policed, patrolled by the coalition forces, including the Americans, that clearly isn't happening at the moment.
Well, that was Gary O'Donoghue in Washington. Let's talk a little more in terms of what we are seeing there on the ground. We know we're a few hours into this operation, but very much the early days. So let's bring in Ece Gökçedef again, who is from our Turkish service, following all of this for us. And as you were sitting there listening to Gary, you were making the point to me that what we've seen so far, we're 3-4 hours in, is not the ground operation. It's simply the air, the artillery. So we still are waiting for all of those forces that we have seen amassed over the last 2 or 3 days to actually get involved in this.
Yes, the operation started almost 4 hours ago, and so far whatever we see is just the artillery shells, and the Turkish jets, Turkish fighter jets have been bombing the Syrian cities on the border. But the ground forces and also Syrian armed opposition have been meeting on the border to start the ground operation, but it hasn't started yet. And there is a statement from the Turkish army which says they are only targeting the YPG bases and military build-ups so far. So that's what we know so far in 4 hours after start of the operation.
Is there anything that you're hearing in terms of the other side? So that is what the Syrian forces are doing. What about the Kurdish fighters? Are we getting any sort of early indication whether they're retreating, trying to get away, or whether they're going to stay and fight?
Actually, not from the Kurdish side, but from the Turkish side, there is also some state agency reports that they have been also doing mortar shells from the Syrian side to Turkish border towns, but there is no casualties yet. Also, the Kurdish side says, Kurdish fighters says, there have been some casualties in Kurdistan, in Syria, from the Turkish artillery shelling and the fighter jets bombing. But Turkish side says that there is no casualties so far because they're only targeting the military build-up. So there is two sides of this operation so far. And also what we know, the spokesperson of PYD, who has been before the leader of PYD, says that we're open to any discussions with the Syrian regime to protect our borders, but only in condition of protecting our autonomy in Syria.
You made the point we're about 4 hours in. This operation started with that single line that came from President Erdogan saying the operation has started. We've just in the last little while had pictures of the president talking to his defence minister who's in charge of this military operation. Is there any indication, do you think, that all of the international pressure that we've been hearing about, so we're hearing about the UN, we know that a number of ambassadors have been called in a number of capitals. Is that likely to have any impact on President Erdogan?
I don't think so, personally, because Turkey and Turkish authorities have been prepared for these condemnations and all the reactions from European countries and also the UN and the international community. They have been prepared for this since the beginning of Afrin operation 2 years ago. So I don't think it will change any objectives or anything on the Turkish army's move on the field.
I suspect a lot will depend on just how far into Syria the incursion actually goes, and we still wait to actually see how that pans out. It is far too early to say at this stage. What we do know, in terms of what we've heard from the SDF, though, is that they are saying they have stopped their operations against ISIS fighters. That is a significant statement, isn't it?
It is definitely a significant statement, and it will really be concerned. It will concern the European countries as well. But the Turkish side thinks that the YPG has only been using the fight against Daesh to to create their own state and their own land. So I don't think that the Turkish authorities will take it seriously and will change their attitude towards the YPG.
Just tell me a little more about what the official intention is. So President Erdogan talks about safe zones. He talks about moving refugees that currently are inside Turkey. What is the number we're talking about in terms of...
3.6 million Syrian refugees. And there is more than Syrian refugees in Turkey, but he's talking about Syrian refugees and returning them back to Syria, and which is only possible in a safe zone, which he says, it's in his words. And he actually made the call during the UN General Assembly in September. He says he can turn back 2 million Syrian refugees from Turkey to Syria if he creates the 30 kilometers of safe zone. But if he goes further south, he can even replace all the 3 million refugees in Turkey and also the ones in Europe. He can take them all back to Syria because he's actually planning to establish a housing project and settlements in Syria after the operation.
I was talking a little earlier from the United States to the former Republican Senator Jeff Flake, who was talking about the unforeseen consequences of a move like this, the dangers of the move like this. You know this area very well. You know the ongoing strains between Turkey and the Kurdish forces. Just give me a sense of the dangers that a move like this actually represents.
You mean in Syria, the dangers in Syria. So the YPG has been keeping thousands of ISIS fighters and their families, women and children. And now Turkey is taking the responsibility for all these fighters. And Turkey says, President Erdogan and all his aides say that they can take the responsibility because they have been doing this in Afrin and also in the Euphrates Shield area so far for the last 3 years. But we know is the European countries do not trust Turkey on this matter, but we will see how it will work. But we know from Turkish officials who spoke to BBC Turkish, they say that they will only be responsible for the ISIS fighters and their families only in the areas that Turkey does the operation. So it won't actually include all the ISIS fighters in northeast Syria. It's only the area in the operation.
Thanks very much once again. What I referred there to that interview with Senator Jeff Flake. Lindsey Graham has been again tweeting that this represents a disaster in the making. I put that point to Senator Jeff Flake and got his thoughts on what we're seeing in Syria today.
What we've seen just in the last 72 hours with regard to Syria are Exhibit A there, the chaos that is going on. And in the past, at least, we've had individuals like Jim Mattis, Secretary of Defense, and others who, put up some kind of guardrails or could convince him to back down. We just don't have that now in the White House or in the various agencies.
And how dangerous is that?
So what's happening, that's extremely dangerous. And the Kurds are obviously feeling it right now. but we really have an ally problem, and it's only going to get sharper as we go along, unless there are people who can tell the president no.
I said right at the start that I was going to come to what is happening in Syria. Before I ask you a question, I just want to actually put the tweet from Lindsey Graham, who, of course, is such an ally of the president, but a critic on this. He talks about what is happening and northern Syria, the situation there, as a disaster in the making. He went on to say the Trump administration had shamelessly abandoned their Kurdish allies and added, "I urge President Trump to change course while there is still time by going back to the safe zone concept that was working." Do you share that assessment with Lindsey Graham, Senator?
I do. And in the past, the president has made statements, he's threatened, but he's walked it back a bit in terms of pulling troops out previously in Syria when cooler heads have prevailed. But now there are very few people around him, and Lindsey has been consistent on this issue. But it seems the president isn't listening anymore. And so I do agree with Lindsey, and there are a lot. It's not just Lindsey. I haven't heard any comment from maybe Rand Paul. Mike Lee shares a different view, but beyond that, it's near unanimous in the Senate that people are extremely alarmed at what's going on in Syria right now.
Senator Jeff Flake talking to me just a little earlier. We're going to take a couple of minutes break. When we're back, we'll get the latest from the BBC's Middle East editor, Jeremy Bone. We'll get the latest from Washington. We'll get the latest from the UN. We'll get the latest from the Turkish government themselves. And of course, our teams are on the ground, so we'll hear from them. All of that is coming up on today's Global. That's a couple of minutes away. Don't go away.